we consider the time which was required to come to an understanding on these points and carry our reflections back to the period when the affairs of Spain originated, we are compelled to admit that they could never have been meditated or carried into effect except under Monsieur de Talleyrand's ministry. Had it been otherwise, it would have been necessary to set a direct negotiation on foot to keep pace with his own ordinary duties, which negotiation he assuredly would have opposed by every means in his power until he had compelled the intrusive diplomatist to give way. It would have been no less his duty than his right to adopt such a course. Admitting even that the enterprise upon Spain had wholly emanated from the emperor's mind, it was nevertheless impossible for this prince to give it effect without certain preliminary steps, without his developing his own ideas and procuring their adoption by those men whose situation required that they should mature them in Spain as well as in France. Now I ask, which of us was the most calculated for a negotiation that allowed of no intercourse in writing, and yet required the keeping up of an active correspondence? That man unquestionably who, for the 10 or 12 previous years, had presided over all the transactions which had taken place between France and Spain. The man, in short, who had strengthened the credit of the Prince of the Peace, with whom he had had a long series of previous intercourse of every description. No one else in France could have been entrusted with such a negotiation, for what documents could have been placed in the hands of a person who would have had to commence by an overture insulting to the feelings of the most debased character? The more I reflect on every circumstance that must have preceded the conclusion of the Treaty of Fontainebleau, the more I retain the conviction that the plan of changing the Spanish dynasty is a conception of which the whole merit belongs to Monsieur de Talleyrand and to the Prince of the Peace. It is the joint production of both diplomatists, and was only submitted to the emperor when it was found possible to demonstrate to him the facility of carrying it into effect. I will develop my reasons for forming this opinion by following. After the Battle of Friedland, the battle he had meditated of restoring the kingdom of Poland, the emperor might have made sure of success. He could not have abandoned that gigantic enterprise in order to attempt another, unless the success of the latter had been clearly demonstrated to him. That is to say, unless he had previously made himself acquainted with whatever had been done in furtherance of such an object. If the idea of the changes in Spain had originated with the emperor, it would have been much more easy for him to give them effect. After restoring the independence of Poland, which would have possessed sufficient strength in itself to keep in check the remaining power of the Russian Empire, and Austria was unable to oppose anything that might be meditated beyond the Pyrenees. Supposing, therefore, that such had been the emperor's afterthought, it may safely be asserted that there existed a lever which set the enterprise in motion sooner than he intended. That lever was the Prince of the Peace, who, finding himself on a bed of thorns at Madrid, was hastening by every means in his power the downfall of his masters in order to escape the ruin which threatened him. He stood already on the breach, was calling for assistance, and pretended that he could hold out no longer, that his own credit once gone, France would lose possession of Spain. Being placed in this dreadful position, he magnified the danger in order to hasten the application of the remedy, and he consented to whatever was proposed to him. Now a man like Monsieur de Talleyrand, who well knew the situation and resources of the Prince of the Peace, could not fail to impose upon him conditions analogous to the state of embarrassment into which he was thrown. Amongst the many considerations which inclined Monsieur de Talleyrand not to abandon the Prince of the Peace, there were several which operated also as inducements for compassing his ruin, and this is the place for relating an anecdote known to very few persons. After the return from Egypt, when the first consul had become chief of the state, he found that an arrangement had been entered into between France and Spain. The latter power had engaged to pay to the former, during the existence of the war, a monthly sum of 5 million francs. The wretched state of our finances compelled the first consul to allow that state of things to remain undisturbed. But after the Battle of Marengo, when order began to be restored, he instructed Monsieur de Talleyrand to write to Spain that as France had no longer any need of the money, he renounced his right to claim it and restore the amount to King Charles as a testimony of the desire which he felt not to be a burden upon his allies. Monsieur de Talleyrand disapproved of the resolution and pointed out to the first consul that, if instead of relinquishing the whole sum, he began by renouncing one half only, this would be attended with a better effect. It would show the progressive improvement of our affairs, and we might moreover claim the merit of having attentively watched the movement when it was found possible to dispense with a succor, which was burdensome to Charles IV. The first consul adopted the idea and issued in consequence an order for the remittance thenceforward of 2,500,000 francs a month. He conceded that his intentions had been carried into effect. Quite the reverse. Spain continued to pay the whole subsidy, and it was only after the Peace of Luneville, when he ordered the second part to be relinquished, that she ceased paying the 5 millions imposed upon her by the Treaty of Bâle. The public treasury, not receiving anything more from Spain, had struck that item from its registers. There existed no further means of defrauding, and there was felt to be danger in continuing to receive the tribute. The treasury received no more than 2,500,000 francs authorized by the emperor, and yet Spain had continued to pay the stipulated 5 millions. What became of the difference? How was the fraud carried on? This is what we are about to explain. If the emperor, instead of dividing the remittance into two portions, had left it unbroken, there would have existed no means of practicing deception, because the treasury of Spain would have had no remittance to make to that of France. Monsieur de Talleyrand could not have avoided writing to Madrid in conformity with the nature of his instructions, or even mentioning the subject to the ambassador of that power in Paris. He would otherwise have exposed himself to the most serious consequences if the emperor had been the first to speak upon it to the ambassador, as might have been the case. On the other hand, had he not communicated to the first consul's intentions, and had Spain continued to pay the total amount of the subsidy, the treasury would have rendered an account of it. The first consul would have found out that his orders had been disobeyed, and Monsieur de Talleyrand would have failed to derive a profit from the business. The Prince of the Peace was similarly situated at Madrid. Had Monsieur de Talleyrand made the slightest communication to the French ambassador in that capital, the latter might have spoken to the king, and it would have been impossible for the Prince of the Peace to apply a single franc of the money to his own use. As this prince was all-powerful, and as he disposed of everything at court, he alone had the means at his command of allowing a monthly sum of 5 millions of francs to be taken out of the Spanish coffers, and yet of suffering no more than 2.5 millions to enter the French treasury. He was a very unlikely man, however, to permit the spoliation of the remainder without stepping in for his share of the spoil. He was the less disposed to act so disinterested a part, as nothing could be done without him. The negotiation was safely carried on between both ministers by means of certain agents of the Prince of the Peace, who were constantly in Paris. I am ignorant of the precise amount of the share which each party secured to himself, but the emperor was aware of the fraud, and he related the circumstance to me. Now, it must be admitted that he could not wish for more favorable circumstances to induce him to negotiate with the Prince of the Peace respecting his projects upon Spain. If the idea originated with himself, Messieurs de Talleyrand and Godoy stood reciprocally in equal need of acting with proper consideration towards, and perhaps of ruining each other. They were the only two men who, without any apprehension of wounding each other's feelings, might mutually set about discussing whatever related to affairs of the nature of those in agitation in respect to Spain. The former had every sort of motive for rejoicing in the elevation of the latter to the summit of power. So far was this circumstance from being injurious to him that it helped to obliterate everything that had taken place between them, and gave a degree of consistency to his present and future position, unless, however, an opportunity should have offered for effectually accomplishing the ruin of the Prince of the Peace. This circumstance of the spoliation of one half of the subsidy from Spain is one of those which did the most serious injury to Monsieur de Talleyrand in the emperor's mind. Though well acquainted with all the details of that business, he continued to employ him because, as he said, the diplomatist might also be considered under a fair aspect. It is in vain that the friends of Monsieur de Talleyrand and himself would attempt to make it be believed that he was a perfect stranger to the enterprise upon Spain. The report has no doubt been industriously spread that he had taken no part in it. He even succeeded in conveying this idea to the diplomatic body which had remained in Paris, whilst the Emperor proceeded to Bayonne, where he had taken along with him the Duc de Cador as Minister for Foreign Affairs. Those gentlemen of the diplomatic body reported to their respective courts what was stated in Paris, added to their report that Monsieur de Talleyrand had no connection with what was going forward, and even was opposed to it. He strongly encouraged this opinion and perseveringly circulated it, as it was of a nature to create a desire for his return to the ministry. The fact, however, so undeniable of his having had a share in everything relating to the enterprise that when the Prince of Asturias and his brother, the infant Don Carlos, quitted Bayonne to repair to the place fixed upon for their residence, the Emperor ordered him to proceed to Valence for the purpose of receiving them, and to remain for some time in their company. He accordingly repaired to that residence and commissioned Major Henry, who was on his return to us, to present his friendly regards to me. You will tell General Savary, added he, when taking leave of the Major, that no one ever gave a better account of a mismanaged business than he has done of the one in which we are embarked. I cannot but pay him my compliments on the occasion. He has saved us from very serious evils. Monsieur de Talleyrand was ignorant of what I had been doing in Spain, and only formed his opinion from the result. But his very congratulations were an admission that there existed some other project which was to have been executed in a manner different from the turn which it had actually taken. There is no doubt that affairs would have assumed quite their departure for America. Another aspect of the king and the royal family had simply taken their departure for America. This is the course which Monsieur de Talleyrand had contemplated and prepared, and to this circumstance alone is to be ascribed his professing himself a stranger to what was taking place in Spain. He most probably spoke in this sense during his stay with the princes at Valence, but no other inference should be drawn from it than that, having been removed from public affairs, he felt no interest in their success, and that it was more advantageous for him to coincide in opinions with those who disapproved of that enterprise and to attempt to justify it. But no sensible man at all acquainted with the internal administration of France at that period can, without doing violence to his own judgment, entertain any doubt of the direct and immediate share taken by Monsieur de Talleyrand in the changes of dynasty in Spain. On this occasion, however, he was foremost in evincing a desire to destroy that branch of the House of Bourbon, as he had been to destroy the reigning branch at Parma in the first instance, and then in Tuscany, when the latter country had been bestowed upon the infant of Parma, whose son it was again wrested through Monsieur de Talleyrand's instrumentality. Generally speaking, he was of opinion that there existed no security for the Empress dynasty so long as the scepter of any country should be swayed by a branch of the Bourbon family. Besides these several considerations, the unseemly nature of the private life of Monsieur de Talleyrand, who is a priest in wedlock, will fix the conviction that few men were more interested than he was in opposing the events which so soon followed the departure of the Empress from Paris. This sentiment appeared to be imposed upon him by a variety of other circumstances to which I was no stranger, independently of the pledges which Monsieur de Talleyrand was considered to have given in favor of an order of things which extended its protection to his own domestic arrangements. It must be observed that it required rather stronger grounds than mere suspicions to justify the adoption of violent measures against him, for he was undeniably one of the first personages of the empire. Even supposing that I had been in possession of any fact criminatory of his conduct, I could not have resorted to any measures against him without previously obtaining an authority from the Council of Regency and in its absence from Prince Joseph, but neither the one nor the other would have allowed me to act against Monsieur de Talleyrand without their first considering the motives and acknowledging the necessity of such a proceeding. Each of them might be placed in a similar situation, and the cause of Monsieur de Talleyrand in this case was necessarily viewed as one of a personal nature to both. Had I ventured upon causing his arrest on my own responsibility, a loud clamor would have been raised against me, and not without a great show of reason. Nevertheless, had I been put in possession of any incipient act of manifest guilt, I should not have hesitated in the conduct I had to pursue. If, for instance, the English newspapers, when giving an account of the arrival of the agent sent to the Comte d'Artois, who was then at Vesoul, had not mutilated the name in such a manner as to prevent my discovering it, I should have instantly taken my measures, because I knew enough of previous circumstances in respect to the individual in question to be satisfied that even if he had been dispatched by M. de Talleyrand, the latter could not be ignorant of his departure any more than the object of his journey. In the absence of that information, I acted with circumspection, the more so as when I reflected on all that had been said to me respecting the hopes so fondly entertained by those persons who were formerly attached to the house of Bourbon, I could have no doubt that the intrigues set on foot were as little alarming in their consequences as the dust kept in agitation by a whirlwind. The reports, in fact, which reached me from all those parts of France which had been deluged with the blood spilt during our civil discords, and where the royalist party had not been wholly uprooted, were such as to give little cause for uneasiness to the public authority. There, as well as in every other portion of the empire, the people were resigned to yield obedience to the course of events which would ere long assume a decided character. Chapter 4. And it was considered that the rupture of the conferences at Châtillon-sur-Seine was not known at Paris until the 22nd of March, and that the Allies entered that capital on the 30th, it will be clearly seen that the conspirators had been forestalled, that their ideas were yet unsettled, and that they had not agreed upon any particular course of conduct. In this state of uncertainty, therefore, it was most conformable with the dictates of prudence to wait until the real intentions of the Allies should assume a gradual development. Mr. de Talleyrand had too much penetration not to perceive this. He was too circumspect to hazard an attempt which could not have been productive of a decisive effect, because he had acted in this manner. Common sense would have at least suggested to him the necessity of concealing himself in Paris on the very day of his receiving an order to depart, instead of coming to solicit my authority for remaining behind. This course was the more easy of adoption, as it was only requisite that he should obtain the delay of a few hours. I have since learned that the project he had in view when he eluded the order to remove was to set to work in favor of a regency. He confided this circumstance to a person who reported it to me, and who was acquainted with it before his own departure from Blois. The sequel will show to what trifling circumstance his failure of success was owing. It was in every respect his decided interest to endeavor to promote the adoption of a regency. Under this order of things, he would preserve all his advantages, together with the influence of the men of the Revolution. He would moreover escape the unceasing vexations to which he had been subjected during the 2 last years of the Emperor's reign. He would also avoid the inconveniences to which he would sooner or later be infallibly exposed after the restoration of the House of Bourbon, and if the installation of the government of the Regency were not accomplished with measures of a personal nature against the Emperor, a very unlikely circumstance, he would have farther advantage of being enabled to contribute to the return of that prince to the government. He had it in his power, therefore, to recover the position which he had lost upon his quitting the Department of Foreign Affairs. My mind was a prey to this alternation of contradictory ideas, but had I not been arrested by these various considerations, and if, instead of intimating to Monsieur de Talleyrand my orders for his departure, I had resorted to measures of violence and forcibly sent him to Blois, the return of the House of Bourbon would still have taken place, for Paris abounded in men eager for commotions and for obtaining places of public employment. There was felt so great an indifference for the existing order of things that a Cossack was almost fancied to be a Washington. The experiment of dethroning sovereigns was so familiar to so many intriguers that in seeking for one individual so disposed, the Emperor of Russia would readily have found 100. What excuse could I have given if, after carrying away Monsieur de Talleyrand, the same occurrence had happened, which actually came to pass? Would not and the emperor in particular, have been justified in saying our minister of police is a consummate blockhead. He has deemed it an act of great wisdom to raise the enmity of Mr. de Talleyrand at the very moment when the latter was under the necessity of serving the emperor in attention to his own safety. In the blindness of his zeal, he forces away from Paris the very man he should have sent there if he had not happened to be on the spot. If his own common sense did not point out to him the course he ought to pursue, he had no right, at all events, to indulge in such latitude of authority. By what right does he assume to himself to arrest a dignitary of the empire without an order from the emperor, particularly after he had communicated to the sovereign the forebodings of his mind, without receiving in return any special instructions for his guidance? I should undoubtedly have been taxed with ignorance and presumption, if not even with much more serious charges for venturing upon such a course. The emperor would never have forgiven me such a want of penetration. How often has he not reprimanded the police for arresting individuals upon mere suspicion? It must be admitted that the situation in which I was placed was one of sufficient delicacy to call for the most mature consideration of every measure I might adopt. I have already stated the fact of my having solicited of the emperor to appoint me his commissioner of Paris in the event of the enemies obtaining possession of the capital. But he had desired me in reply to follow the empress, if the course of events should compel that princess to quit Paris. The trying circumstances in which we were placed and the positive injunctions of the chief of the state sufficiently enjoined me to be circumspect in my conduct. I conceived that I had done everything in my power under the latitude of action allowed to me, and I cannot at this very day reproach myself with the slightest failure in the performance of my duty. I accordingly directed my course towards Orleans and overtook at Etampes Monsieur Molay, the high judge, who had followed the same road for the purpose of avoiding the obstructions which prevented the possibility of proceeding by the road through Versailles, Rambouillet, and Chartres. We imparted to each other our gloomy presentiments, which very shortly assumed a character of reality. A courier was brought to me in the night who was the bearer of an order for the empress, then at Rambouillet, to repair to Blois. This courier informed me that he had quitted the emperor in the afternoon at the town of Fontainebleau, where he had just arrived with Monsieur de Caulaincourt, and that he had immediately left it for Paris, to which city the whole army was proceeding, though its advance guard had not yet reached Montereau. The first impulse of my mind suggested to me that I should start to join the emperor, reflecting, however, that it might become necessary to adopt various measures at Blois or in any other place at which the empress might stop. I relinquished that idea in obedience to the order given to me to repair to the presence of the princess. I was the more readily induced to adopt this course, as by comparing the hour at which the courier had quitted the emperor at Fontainebleau with what must have taken place in Paris before he could arrive there, I easily discovered that he would be apprised of everything before I could join him. My conjecture was fully verified by the event. I accordingly continued my journey to Orleans and afterwards to Tours, where I thought the empress had arrived, as I conceived that the courier would not find her at Rambouillet and would only overtake her at Tours, which was her original destination. Having been mistaken in my surmise, I was under the necessity of returning to Blois, which I reached previously to the arrival of the empress. The occurrences at Blois were of so trifling a nature in comparison with those which were about to take place in Paris, that I naturally give precedence to that latter in my narrative. The occurrences at Blois. The emperor pushed on as far as a place called the Cour de France, which is the second stage from Paris on that road, and is at a distance of about 3 leagues from the gate of the capital. He met at the Cour de France General Hulin, who was on his way from Paris, which he had left after the capitulation concluded by Marshal Marmont with the enemy. He learned from that general officer that the capital had surrendered, that the French troops were to evacuate it in the night, and the enemy to take possession the next morning. It is impossible to form an idea of the painful impression which this news created upon my mind. He had anticipated the possibility of the enemy's marching upon Paris, and had mentioned the circumstance to the officers of the National Guard previously to his own departure for the army. He had expressed to them his wish that he should hold out for a few days so as to enable him to hasten to their assistance. He had kept his word. since Paris had only been attacked that very morning, and before the close of the day he was already at its gates with his whole army. But instead of a defense of a few days, the capital did not resist for the space of a few short hours. It was not yet midday, in fact, when the determination was adopted of coming to a capitulation. All this can only be ascribed to the cowardice of some and to the blind eagerness of others to rely upon the enemy's generosity. After the rupture of the conference of Châtillon, the emperor, as I have already stated, had made a movement towards the fortress of Lorraine, with the whole of his army being, however, informed on his way of the march of the grand army of the Allies upon Paris. He instantly retraced his steps from the point at which he had arrived for the purpose of forcing the passage of the Maine at Vitry-le-Français. But the enemy had provided for the defense of that place, and he would have lost too much time in attempting to carry it. He had, accordingly, to relinquish all hope of the important advantage which he might have derived from returning to Paris in the rear of the enemy's army, whose line of operations he had succeeded in cutting off, and he immediately took the surest road by following the banks of the Seine. He had certainly not loitered on his way. Had Paris held out for 2 days longer, his army would have entered it, and everyone is well acquainted with his skill in the management of affairs. He would have had no hesitation to throw the arsenals open to the people. His presence would have inflamed the multitude. He would have imparted a salutary direction to their enthusiasm, and Paris would no doubt have imitated the example of Saragossa. Or, to speak more correctly, the enemy would not have ventured to make any attempt upon it, for, independently of the emperor's being for them a Medusa's head, it ascertained at a later period that in the battle which preceded the surrender of the capital, they had nearly consumed the whole of their ammunition. Tears of blood are ready to flow at the bare recollection of these facts. The emperor's situation was bitter beyond description. He was hastening to Paris with all speed, but the corps of Marshals Mortier and Marmont were leaving it to take up a position on the road to Fontainebleau. He was only accompanied by Monsieur de Caulaincourt and Monsieur de Saint-Aignan, one of his equerries. He dispatched the former to Paris with unlimited powers, directing him to exercise the functions his commissioner in the capital so long as his enemy should stay there, and he returned to Fontainebleau. The army shortly afterwards debouched before him. He assembled the guard who formed the advance, passed them in review, informed them of the events which had recently taken place, and announced his soldiers of marching forward. "Soldiers," he said to these gallant fellows, "the enemy has gained 3 marches upon us and taken possession of Paris. We must drive them out of it. Some worthless Frenchmen, some emigrants whom we had pardoned, have set up the white cockade and joined the enemy. Dastards that they are, they shall receive the reward of this new crime. Let us swear to conquer or die, and to cause that 3-colored cockade to be respected, which has accomplished us for these 20 years past in the road to glory and renown." Their proposal was greeted with a general acclamation, and the guard proceeded to range itself in a second line behind the river of Essonne. The measure adopted by the emperor, sending Monsieur de Caulaincourt to treat for peace on any terms, was assuredly the most judicious under the existing circumstances. But the Duke of Vincennes was, of all the high functionaries, the one least acquainted with the administrative details of a mighty city upon whose destinies those of the state were depending. I was well acquainted with the power of opinion exercised over the people by the several municipal authorities of the city, and this was my motive for drawing the emperor's attention to the necessity of fixing beforehand upon a commissioner thus qualified, and for offering my own services in that capacity. This was in every respect the peculiar duty of a minister of police. If the emperor felt a want of confidence in me, he ought instantly to have removed me from the administration instead of compromising so many interests by a single act. I was not blind to the motive of the refusal which he gave to me. It did not proceed from any want of confidence in my abilities. The emperor was better able than anyone else to appreciate them in the several negotiations which he had entrusted to me. Neither could it arise from any mistrust of my military talents, since, of all those he had left in Paris who belonged to the profession of arms, I had been the most frequently engaged on the memorable fields of battle, of which nothing is now left beyond the bare recollection of them to console us at the close of our historical career. When I happened to be with the army. The emperor employed me in every enterprise of all his aides de camp. I was the one whose activity and bodily health he was the most unsparing. I had so often been scolded as to have acquired a considerable share of prudence and penetration. The emperor must certainly have thought so, since he furnished me some opportunities of acquiring glory in certain chief commands where I acted in perfect independence of his control. I had been fortunate enough not to disappoint his hopes, or at least fortune had crowned all my military combinations with success. It was after the encounter at Astralenka that he gave me the ribbons of the Legion of Honor with a pension for life of 20,000 francs. It was, in short, on the field of battle that I had won the honors which had been heaped upon me. Nevertheless, he bestowed his confidence in another quarter. I was at no loss to discover from whence had proceeded the blow thus directed against me. In the situation in which the emperor was placed, his mental faculties were wholly absorbed by that care he had to bestow upon the army, of which he was the soul. I had often beheld him under circumstances of a much less painful nature when fighting by his side. He was exclusively wrapped up in military combinations and gave little or no attention to the affairs of the administration, which he relinquished to the respective public functionaries who followed in his suite. I had received at Troy, after the Battle of Brienne, an order to adopt a variety of measures which had certainly never entered his mind. The same, or perhaps worse, may have happened on this occasion. Such, at least, is a conjecture I have formed on the subject. It has occurred to me that he had communicated to some of the persons of his suite the proposal I had made, that he should leave me in Paris at the moment of the enemy's arrival, and that this individual, who had already determined upon my ruin, had prevented his acceptance of my proposal by observing that I was by no means adequate to the task, that I should place myself under the control of M. de Talleyrand, who already exercised a kind of magic spell over me. These shameful insinuations alone were calculated to prevent the emperor from reposing in me that confidence to which I was entitled as a reward for the zeal I was evincing in his service at a time when everyone was beginning to desert him. How often during the course of that campaign had I not occasion to regret not having been called to the administration a few years sooner? I should then have acquired that moral strength in it which is conferred by the power of public opinion, and I should unquestionably have turned it to a useful account. As the emperor always formed his judgment upon a mathematical basis, there was but one plain course to be pursued, that of pure and undisguised truth. In any report or proposal made to him, it unfortunately happened that during the last 2 years of his government he was incessantly harassed by men of low passions and given to petty intrigues, who sprang up in swarms around him. Marshals Bessières and Duroc coincided in opinion with me on the subject. We often lamented together the occurrences that were taking place under our eyes. Monsieur de Caulaincourt, on his arrival in Paris, made himself acquainted with the state of affairs previously to repairing to the headquarters of the Emperor Alexander at Bondy, the first stage on the road to Strasbourg. Monsieur de Talleyrand, who had quitted Paris in conformity with his instructions to follow the Empress, had returned to the capital, and it has been reported to me that he was stopped on the road by Monsieur Torton, chief of the staff of the National Guard, who found himself at the head of that corps in consequence of the departure of Marshal Moncey, its commander-in-chief, and of Monsieur de Montesquieu, the second in command. This, I was told, was mutually agreed upon between them, a farther proof that Monsieur de Talleyrand had not made up his mind to any particular course of conduct, and was even apprehensive of the responsibility of taking upon himself to remain at the theater of the most important events. Such was the fatality which attended the emperor, that the several chiefs of legions of the National Guard, who were provided with places at court or with public employments, have been desired to follow the empress, though she had not the least occasion for their services, instead of being left in Paris to direct the movements of the persons under their orders, which was the only inducement on the part of the emperor for placing them at the head of the National Guard. They had no sooner left than they were immediately replaced, and the choice fell upon men of directly opposite opinions, a course which secured the means of carrying into effect every contemplated measure. Monsieur Torton forgot all the favors conferred upon him by the emperor, who had made considerable pecuniary advances at a moment when the honor of his firm was compromised, advances which had not been reimbursed at the time of his taking up arms against his benefactor. Monsieur de Talleyrand, having returned to Paris, bent his mind to the object of securing a position for himself, which might prevent the Emperor Alexander from dispensing with his services, whilst carrying into effect those projects which he was known to entertain. He immediately caused a meeting to be convened of those men, ever ready for a movement, who are to be found in the various classes of society, and he had not to encounter any opposition, since there prevailed a total absence of everything that might afford the slightest indication of the Emperor's personal influence. Monsieur de Talleyrand was not slow in discovering the means which he had at command. He organized upon paper a provisional administration, but took no decided part until he had first ascertained what was the Emperor of Russia's final determination. He passed the whole evening with the Duke of Ragusa at his residence in the Rue de Paradis, in the suburb of Saint-Denis, where the Marshal was still to be found, as he had the whole night before him to evacuate Paris, which the enemy were only to enter on the following morning. Many of Marmont's friends were also in that company. Monsieur de Talleyrand was well aware that whatever the Emperor Alexander might attempt to do, he could not concur with that prince without first having at his command a portion of the army, which was the only physical and moral strength remaining to the Emperor Napoleon. He was not blind to the fact that so long as it remained unbroken, it would fix the general opinion of the nation in such a manner that the party which was preparing to alter the existing authority would succeed at most in kindling a civil war, which would render everything once more problematical. By persuading Marshal Marmont to detach himself from the Emperor's cause, he had, independently of the advantage of occasioning a farther reduction in the Emperor Napoleon's resources, that of affording greater facilities to the Emperor of Russia for carrying into effect whatever measures he might determine upon. He exerted himself, therefore, to draw Marmont into his views. There had existed no previous connection of a public nature between them, nor even any social intercourse that might furnish him with an opportunity of opening proposals of so delicate a nature for the Duke of Ragusa, who still nourished in all their fervor the sentiments which had sprung up in his breast with the first laurels he had culled in the campaigns of Italy. But Monsieur de Talleyrand held at his disposal Monsieur de Bourrienne, the companion of the Marshal of his youthful days, and whose sincere attachment for the Emperor had been of contemporary growth, having rendered him effectual services during the 12 most laborious years of his life. Bourrienne had been removed from the cabinet in consequence of imputations cast upon him. The Emperor, to whom he was represented as a man unworthy of the confidence reposed in his character, afterwards appointed him his minister at Hamburg, where Bourrienne fixed his residence until the annexation of that country to France. On his return to Paris, he was assailed by the same spirit of enmity. Those intriguers who had procured his removal from the cabinet felt alarmed at the possibility of the return of a man of talent to favor, and neglected no means of dissuading the Emperor from recalling or even again employing him in any capacity whatever. Absurd reports were brought back to him respecting Mr. de Bourrienne, which threw down many petty attacks upon the latter, finding himself deserted by his sovereign and the sport of such persecutions. Bourrienne took part with the Emperor's enemies. I do not approve of his conduct, but I cannot help pitying him, being well acquainted with the injustices of the reproaches leveled at his character. I had defended his cause to the best of my abilities, and whenever I mentioned his name, the Emperor appeared to be kindly disposed towards his former secretary. It did not, however, depend upon me to procure his being named to suitable employment and to prevent his becoming the Emperor's personal enemy. I failed in all my endeavors. Bourrienne espoused the cause of the adverse party and brought to it all his talent and activity. The inmost sentiments of Marmont's heart were known to him. He was intimately acquainted with him during the campaigns of Italy and Egypt, and was gifted with too much penetration not to have perceived the weak side by which he might be successfully attacked. He had besides at his command an auxiliary fully capable of corrupting any heart which it might be Talleyrand's interest to win over. This was Montessuie, a former aide-de-camp of the marshal who was familiar with all the sentiments of his chief. The intrigue was just set on foot, but it was managed by men of too much experience to neglect the means of bringing it to maturity by the time when it would be advisable to unfold it to the Emperor of Russia in order to derive all the advantages that were anticipated from it. Care was accordingly taken to represent to Marmont, as a point already settled and agreed upon, the necessity of a revolution in which he was even marked out for the principal part. He was addressed in the name of friendship, and was urged not to lose this opportunity of preserving the honors he had acquired, of saving France, and of placing himself in an attitude which would enable him to be of service to his friends. Let us hasten to acknowledge it whilst we are yet in time to do so. Marmont showed himself true to his early attachment. He was proof against all the attempts at seduction, and withdrew after declaring that nothing should detach him from his duties, and that he would die at the Emperor's side. A friend of Madame la Marechale, who was present at the scene, related to me that he did not quit the Duke of Ragusa until 11 o'clock at night, and that he returned home with the conviction upon his mind that the Duke would keep his word and sooner die than abandon the Emperor's cause. Such was the opinion of himself which the Marshal had left behind him amongst his friends at the moment when he quitted Paris to join his troops on the road to Fontainebleau. M. de Talleyrand had obtained nothing from him, but he was too deeply skilled in the science of judging the human heart to renounce the hope of overcoming the Marshal's scruples, and the sequel will show by what means he succeeded in leading him astray. Chapter 5. In his endeavors to ascertain the state of affairs in Paris, M. de Caulaincourt could not fail to perceive that the spirit of intrigue against the emperor was already at work. Its movements were the more visible as it was wholly unrestrained in consequence of the removal of all those who might have thrown any obstacle in the way of its progress. As in whichever direction he turned, he found all government places filled up by intruders. He could not but ascribe these changes to certain previous communications with the enemy. This conviction was the more powerfully forced upon him by circumstances, and when at Châtillon he had had more opportunities than anyone else of judging of their intentions. He became the dupe of appearances and fancied that everything had been prepared beforehand, whilst, on the contrary, nothing had yet been determined upon. M. de Talleyrand, whom he did not fail to visit on his arrival, confirmed him in his erroneous impressions, for experienced intriguers have a peculiar tact in representing as already effected what remains as yet to be accomplished. M. de Caulaincourt, whose chief mission was at the headquarters of the Emperor of Russia, hastened to repair thither with the greater eagerness, as there alone it would be in his power to solve the enigma by the language that might be addressed to him, when he would be enabled to regulate the conduct he should pursue in respect to the second part of his mission, that which related to his remaining in Paris as the Emperor's commissioner during the stay of the Allies in that capital. As soon as the capitulation had been signed and notified to the civil authorities, the municipal council met and proceeded in a body to Bondy in order to request of the Emperor of Russia that he would spare the capital from injury. It was headed according to the customary form by the prefect of the department, and the prefect of police had commenced its journey on the day after signing the capitulation, and had consequently got the start of M. de Caulaincourt. The Emperor Alexander detained the deputation a long time before he granted it an audience, and from what was reported to me by an eyewitness, he gave them a rather harsh reception. Such was at least their first impression. Nevertheless, he softened his tongue and said to them, amongst other things, that the chances of war had placed him in possession of the capital, that he was now hostile to the nation, but had but one enemy in France, against whom alone he waged war. I lament, he added, the evils which he has drawn down upon you, and shall endeavor to mitigate them by quartering as few troops as possible in Paris, and stationing the remainder its vicinity. He asked if there were many barracks in Paris, and was told in reply that they could admit of a body of 10,000 men. Well, then, was his reply, this would be some relief to the inhabitants, to whom neither I nor my allies wish any harm. You may give them this assurance as coming from them as well as from myself. He dismissed from his presence the municipal body, who remarked that he had avoided entering upon an explanation of the plans which everyone knew he was meditating to carry into effect, whilst the municipal body was repairing to Bondy. The Emperor Alexander had dispatched to Paris Count Nasserota, his minister for foreign affairs, the same who had been attached to the last Russian legation. His mission was intended for the purpose of sounding the views of the leaders of the party and of correctly ascertaining the resources at the disposal of the conspirators. Nasserota alighted at the hotel of Monsieur de Talleyrand, whom he knew to have very recently opened a closer communication with Hartwell. The conditions transmitted by Madame Aimée de Coigny had been accepted. This lady, who had been in turns Duchess de Fleury and Madame de Montreux, and in consequence of her divorce had resumed her first name, had communicated with her grandfather, Marshal de Coigny, who resided in London. The latter hastened to lay before the king the repentance and attachment of Monsieur de Talleyrand, and to submit at the same time the reservations of that diplomatist. Accept his offer, replied the prince. Provided I reascend my throne, you may promise everything. This bargain, which was known to Castlereagh, could be no secret to the Emperor of Russia. Nasserota was at liberty to select between the projects laid down at Frankfurt and London, whichever most suited his views. His choice was soon made. Alexander had long formed the determination of changing the dynasty which ruled over France, if the course of events should not militate too strongly against his views. This had been the settled idea of his mind ever since his conference with Bernadotte and Abo, and he unquestionably called Moreau to his councils for the express purpose of his concurring to give effect to his wishes. Nasserota accordingly summoned Talleyrand to keep his promises. The latter replied by expressing his readiness to do so, but stated that in order to ensure success, it was necessary that the Emperor Alexander should bestow upon him a signal mark of favor, which might enable him to wield all the influence that was requisite for giving effect to his promises. Alexander immediately sent word that he would alight at his hotel and make it his residence. On quitting the gate of Paris for the purpose of repairing to Bondy, Mr. de Caulaincourt announced himself to the Russian advance posts as the bearer of a flag of truce. He was detained until the emperor's orders should be received. Alexander directed that he should be admitted, and on his way to the Russian headquarters he met the municipal body, which was on its return to the capital. I do not recollect whether M. de Caulaincourt reached Bondy previously to his being admitted into the presence of the Emperor of Russia, or whether he met him actually proceeding towards Paris with the intention of entering it at the head of his army, which was already assembled in readiness to follow him. But I am quite certain that on his being admitted to an interview, Alexander addressed him in these words: "Is this the proper time to call on me, when the mischief is past all remedy? I cannot converse with you at present. Return back to Paris. I will there see you." Monsieur de Caulaincourt accordingly returned in the utmost despondency at finding all his presentiments realized. He proceeded to the prefecture of the Seine and to that of the police, where no farther doubt was entertained as to the intentions ascribed to the Emperor of Russia. No one dared any longer to exceed the limits of his duty or to compromise himself any farther towards the man whom fortune was crowning with her favors. If M. de Caulaincourt had attempted to display his character of commissioner on the part of the Emperor, the least that could have happened to him was not only his being refused admittance to the Emperor of Russia, who was to arrive that very evening, but his being actually sent away. He was therefore under the necessity of leaving everyone in their state of stupor and inaction, and merely watching the course of events, a position which was for him of the most painful nature. The Russian column entered Paris at 12 or 1 o'clock of the day after the capitulation for its surrender, this was a moment of intense suffering for those exalted minds who were witnesses of a sight so humiliating to Frenchmen, hitherto so justly proud of the renown of their country. Our armies have also made triumphant entries into foreign capitals, and have done so moreover after memorable battles whose names have been given to the campaigns in which they were fought. The campaign of Marengo will long retain the name of that town, as well as those of Austerlitz, Jena, and Moscow. They will always stand as monuments of our history in spite of the attacks of envy. But although in the sequel of events so glorious to our arms, the vanquished have had the consolation of making us expiate our victories, we have never witnessed their families rushing forward to meet or to welcome us as their liberators. They never stooped to kiss our feet. Nothing but the picture of affliction met our sight. We never witnessed any abject scenes at Vienna and Berlin where there existed a just cause for apprehending our resentment. All asserted their national dignity, nor did we ever receive more attention than what it was indispensable to pay to us. It was reserved for Paris to exhibit the disgraceful contrast, and to prove to the enemy that it had remained perfectly indifferent to the glory we had acquired, although it had been made the depository of so many trophies. This mode of expressing myself will probably not escape the ordeal of criticism, but my reproaches are exclusively directed against those men who disgraced themselves on the occasion. I hold up to public scorn the servile acts of that period, in order that our descendants, being fired with those sentiments of indignation which such acts are calculated to inspire, should be made acquainted with the nature of the stains. It behooves them to wipe away. Everything in France is of fertile and ready growth. The laurels of victory are natives of its soil, and the means were at command for reaping an ample harvest of them, a sure proof that they had been properly cultivated, and that wheresoever they were transplanted, it became necessary to submit them to the process of naturalization. The despoilers of those laurels have turned them to the account which any ill-gotten property would be applied to, but their roots and the estimate of their original growth are still our own. All is not lost wherever there remains the germ of blended courage with true patriotism. An immense crowd of people had collected to witness the entrance of the Russian army. Curiosity attracted the greater part, and a feeling of indignation brought forth the remainder. Those who had hitherto formed the insignificant portion of society where they were kept within the bounds of decorum broke through the restraints by which their private hatred was held in check. Women, some of them with high titles, were seen to transgress the boundaries of self-respect so far as openly to give way to paroxysms of the most shameful enthusiasm. They rushed through the cavalcade, forming the group which accompanied the Emperor of Russia, evincing an eagerness to behold him much more calculated to draw down a sentiment of contempt than a kindly feeling towards them. Others, who subsisted upon the Emperor Napoleon's liberality, were driving through the streets in calashes, collecting the people together, and uttering imprecations against the man whose favors had been constantly showered upon them. Others, in short, whose time of domestic mourning had scarcely expired, and whose tears should have continued to flow for the loss of their near relatives, exhibited themselves in public on the occasion of this triumph, and appeared in it with branches of myrtle and laurel leaves, which they scattered under the horses' feet. Instead of seeking amongst the population for avengers of their departed husbands, they employed themselves in weaving crowns for those who had deprived those unhappy men of life, and did so with the very flowers which they should have kept in reserve to ornament the graves of their husbands. Each individual of that numerous army, which the Allies displayed to the gaze of the capital, carried a white scarf on his right arm as an emblem calculated to stir up the population. It was asserted that the enemy gave countenance to the assertion that the above distinguishing mark had been given to the troops of the coalition, because it had happened that, in consequence of their having no means of mutual recognition owing to the great variety of their uniforms, they had mistaken each other for enemies and come into open contact. Whether this be true or false, the multitude, whose judgment is never formed but upon ocular evidence of facts, ascribed to this rallying sign a very different interpretation which greatly favored the execution of the plans of the Emperor of Russia. Paris and its vicinity were filled with the enemy's troops. They also pushed forward some advanced corps on the road to Fontainebleau and Orleans. The Emperor of Russia, who had reserved to himself the part of Agamemnon in the crusade, clearly saw that he now held in his hands the fate of that very monarch to whose magnanimity he had personally appealed at a period not far removed, and on the occasion of a triumph much better earned than the one which he was at this moment celebrating with so much pomp. There is in real power an innate sense of generosity. The heart which finds no place for that noble virtue is naturally barren of the qualities so requisite to the man who aims at raising himself above the rest of his species. The Emperor Alexander made the troops file off before him, and then proceeded to the residence of M. de Talleyrand, agreeably to his expressed intention. The means which were to be set at work had been agreed upon at the interview between the diplomatist and M. de Nesselrode. The autocrat immediately resumed the discussion and felt no difficulty in adopting the conviction that what he most anxiously wished for was the most judicious course. The emperor's downfall was determined upon, but it was felt to be desirable that the national vanity should be spared from humiliation, and it became a settled point that French hands should accomplish what would have been rejected by the people if attempted by the Allies. M. de Talleyrand was accordingly directed to bring his friends together and concert with his accomplices the measures of which the existing circumstances required the adoption.